The 50s were built on the backs of housewives. You couldn't have had the 50s if you didn't have a permanent class of indentured servants. Those women paid the price for the prosperity that everyone has nostalgia for.
If I asked you to close your eyes and picture the American dream, what would you see? For me, I picture the 1950s. Dad in suspenders, mom in a dress, a house in the suburbs, and 2.5 kids. Sunday service, the country club, a Ferris wheel, the whole deal. I picture this world almost reflexively, like I have no choice in the matter. Now this is all, of course, just what I imagine the 50s was like, based on images I've seen in movies and TV shows. I was born decades later, so I don't really know. But my mom recently came across some old 8mm footage from her childhood and sent it to me. And it looked exactly as I envisioned. In fact, that's what you're looking at right now. See? That's her right there. And so when Donald Trump says he wants to make America great again, he is hearkening back to this idealized era. And even I must admit that I have some form of nostalgia for this world, even though I never lived in it. It's almost a platonic form, the undisputed archetype for the American dream. But should it be? Luckily for us, my mom did grow up in the 50s, and so today we're going to talk about what the 1950s were really like. The good, the bad, and the parts that they left out of Leave It to Beaver. Because it turns out that this period is filled with contradictions. And so we're going to try and answer the question, is the 1950s really an era that we should want to return to as a nation? Hi, Mom.
Hi, child.
So we decided today that we were going to talk a little bit about the 1950s because this is an era that still looms large in America's imagination, and you actually lived during that era.
I did.
When we think of the 1950s, we think of the nuclear family. Dad goes to work, mom stays at home, kids, white picket fence, house in the suburbs. How much of that was your reality? What was your life like in the 1950s, and what did it feel like?
My life was all of that. I was born in 1947, so I'm a absolute poster child for the baby boomers. I was born 18 months after the end of the war. My parents moved to the suburbs probably around 1950. I grew up in a house in the suburb of New York in Forest Hills, which is Queens, part of Queens. My father was the breadwinner. My mother stayed at home. You know, I still miss the 50s in a lot of ways. I lived in a neighborhood. People knew each other. People had jobs. Everybody's father had a job unless they were, there were some kids mothers were war widows and they had to work. But most people had fathers who worked. Nobody lost their job. People didn't move away. People stayed in the same place for years. So your life felt very stable. And then, of course, you had your church, all the rituals that surrounded the church. The whole school went to church at 9 a.m. on Sunday. And if you didn't go to communion, the nuns knew about it, and you had to explain yourself. It really anchored everybody. Those rituals, and then the leftover kind of hangover family rituals from the ethnic communities that my parents had grown up in. And we had lots of kids to play with. We spent our days outside. Most people didn't have TVs, so we had to make our own fun. I always had breakfast. I never had to worry about food insecurity. We walked to school. We got to school, and we had nuns who, you would never dream in a million years of sassing a teacher. I mean, God help us if we ever did. I mean, the hell we caught at school would be nothing to what our parents would do to us when we got home. When we eventually got a television, we weren't allowed to watch it unless homework was done and chores were done, because my mother thought it was a waste of time. She would say, get out of the house. So we would go out of the house. I had roller skates. I didn't have a baseball bat yet, but we had a broom handle and a pink ball. And so we played stickball. in front of the house, and then eventually we played it in the street. I had a bike. I put my baseball glove on my bike, and I rode for hours all through that neighborhood by myself on all those streets. I never felt unsafe. We walked home in the dark, even in the winter. We just didn't worry. And because there was no internet and there were no computers and you had to get permission to use the telephone, having friends was really different. You tended to have kids in the neighborhood who were your friends. And my parents had to know their parents, and they would all talk to each other so that they always kind of knew where we were, but everybody looked out for each other. It was kind of ideal in a way.
As you describe this, it's very clear why there's such nostalgia for this era. I mean, I didn't grow up in this era, but if you were to ask me to describe the American dream, I would probably describe some version in my head of Leave It to Beaver in the 1950s. It's become the archetype of what ideal American life should be. And so I'm curious, though, because 5 years earlier, the entire world was engaged in a massive catastrophe in World War II. And I'm curious how aware you were of the fact that the world did not look this way just a handful of years earlier.
I mean, I knew about it because of my little Catholic messenger, because we had pictures of the war and we knew what had happened to the Catholic countries. They were always emphasizing the Catholic countries. And because every uncle that I had served in the war, it trickled down. Nobody ever wanted to talk about it. We didn't know nearly as much as we should have, but we knew something about it. But it didn't enter our consciousness. I mean, in 1952, we were at war again in Korea, and then after that, we were in a Cold War. That was so much of a war that we all were issued dog tags in our school in case there was in case we were bombed and they had to identify us. I mean, maybe it's just kids, but it just didn't penetrate our consciousness what those guys had been, and the women too, had been through. It just didn't register for us. It got memory hold by the people who were in it. They really did not want to talk about it except to each other, but they certainly didn't want to talk to us about it. And so, as Kamala said, we all thought to some extent we had fallen from a coconut tree into the 1950s, and that to some extent it had always been that way. And it would always be that way in the future. Now, I knew that wasn't true because my grandmother and my mother spoke about what their lives were like. But the vast majority of us felt like it's always been this way, and it will always be this way.
This is sort of the natural state, the ideal state of human existence is this suburban life. Dad goes to work, mom stays at home. That's the structure, the ideal structure of life. It feels almost eternal in the way that we think about it. But of course, it really is a short-lived era if you think about it, isn't it?
I mean, when you actually think about it from a different perspective, you couldn't see it from a kid's perspective. We were just living it. And I really think that kids think that whatever they're living is the way it's always been. But if you listen to my mother and you listen to my grandmother, you knew it had not always been this way. It had never been this way. And then living into the 60s and beyond, you realized it was never going to be that way again. This was just like this moment in time that was completely unique. We didn't realize it at the time, but it was completely unique, and you can never go back to it. I mean, I am nostalgic about many aspects of it, and, some things have carried over into even now. I mean, my respect for people in authority is still pretty strong. I mean, you had a teacher named Mr. Ng, who was your math teacher and also a coach. And when I became a coach years later, I never could address him by his first name. He kept telling me, "Oh, call me Jean." And I said, "I can't."
Right.
It just seems so disrespectful. So there's that. And then this sense of being secure, of knowing that everybody had a place. I felt this desperate need as a kid to belong, to have a place in something much bigger than myself. I still have that really deep need. I think everyone has it to some extent. And so this was really good for me because, the church was a place that I belonged. My, immigrant parents, families were a place that gave me some sense of continuity and belonging and people watching out for each other and being, taking care of each other.
When you talk about, you heard some stories from your mom and your grandmother about what things were like before, I'm curious, your mom was a very typical of her era, stay-at-home mom. How do you think she felt about having to take that role specifically?
My mother knew that the 50s were an aberration. She grew up completely poor. Her father died when she was 12. She had a single mother, who was a washerwoman, who barely spoke English. She had 5 kids. Everybody worked in the family because they had to keep a roof over my grandmother's head. Everybody in the extended family helped everybody else, cousins and uncles. If somebody was in trouble, everybody pitched in to make sure that family became stable. But it was really hard. She worked all through high school, and then she wanted to be a doctor, and she somehow got into college, into New York City College, and her sisters paid tuition for her, helped her with tuition, and they lent her their car, and they worked 2 jobs to get through college. And she never forgot that. She never forgot how deprived they were during the Depression. It really hit them really hard. They never knew where their next meal was coming from. They had to rely on the charity of the church and the rest of the family. And the Franklin Roosevelt's Works Progress gave them jobs and saved their lives. And to the end of her life, my mother would walk around my house and turn off lights, saying, "You think money grows on trees? Money doesn't grow on trees. What's wrong with you?" I mean, she had that sense of deprivation her whole life. So she wants to be a doctor. She can't be. She meets my father. They get married. He's a doctor. She's a brilliant woman. She's absolutely stunningly brilliant. She really wanted to make something of her life. She was determined to make something of her life. Here comes the 50s. If she had a job then, and I don't know that she did, I think she was busy having babies, she would have gotten kicked out of her job. So here she is in the 50s, using that brilliant mind to raise a bunch of noisy kids. She has no outlet for how smart she is. And she would say to us occasionally, "You have no idea how good you have it." She knew that this was not typical. She did not live in a house. She did not have food security. She did not have a mother who stayed home to take care of the family. Her mother took in wash. That was her life. I know that being in that role was incredibly destructive to her. And then it became incredibly destructive to us because she was so angry. She was so depressed. She was so angry. She was so frustrated. It was wrong. It was unsuitable to her. My father had grown up in a family that was much better off. They had 2 generations to build some wealth. And he played golf, and he taught her how to play golf. And it turned out that she was like a pro quality golfer because she was a great athlete. Once she figured out she could be really good at this, her whole life changed. She needed to be good at something. She needed to be good at something other than figuring out the wallpaper. When she found that out, her life changed. She went all over New York City and the metropolitan area winning golf tournaments. And we were so proud of her. And I think of the people who say we really needed a mother staying at home and all this. At a certain point, we could have taken care of ourselves, and we would have been much happier with a happy mother than with a mother who was so frustrated that she would take us to school and run out and play golf and then try to get home before we got home from school. That was crazy. And it made her crazy. And it made her angry. And she took it out on the family. And that happened to a lot of women.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other side of this era, of course, right? Because on the one hand, you've got sort of an unprecedented amount of abundance. America is the last country standing, basically, after World War II. But you've also got a society that's extremely regimented, social structure. And I imagine that there was a lot of repression and a lot of things going on in families under the surface because of that regimented structure.
Oh my God. I mean, nobody talked about it, and of course, divorce was unacceptable in Catholic families. So people stayed together regardless of how detrimental and harmful it was to the family. It wasn't until I got to college and met women from all over the Eastern Seaboard who had been, raised in Catholic families that I realized how widespread dysfunction was. Alcoholic fathers, guys coming back from the war were self-medicating because nobody would talk about it because that was considered being a coward. But, they were haunted by what they had seen. There was a lot of physical abuse. There was a lot of depression in that generation, and those kids had to live with that. And then there were the mothers who were just like my mom. They were brilliant. They were talented. They were awesome. And there was no outlet for what they did. And there was huge amounts of alcoholism among those women and drug abuse, prescription drug abuse. They were always taking uppers. I mean, the 50s were built on the backs of housewives. You couldn't have had the 50s if you didn't have a permanent class of indentured servants who got no money for what they did, who weren't eligible for Social Security for what they did, even though what they did was incredibly important and valuable and should have had a dollar sign, posted on it. And, those women paid the price for the prosperity that everyone has nostalgia for. In that sense, we should never go back to that. And the other thing that, of course, it was built on was a massive infusion of money, of government money, to make that prosperity possible. That was another thing that was completely invisible at the time. We just thought it's always been this way, it'll always be this way. And that's not true. It had never been that way before. And women had always been in the workplace because they needed to. I mean, my mother worked her entire life. And then she becomes a housewife, and she wanted to work, but she couldn't. The jobs were crappy and they didn't pay well, and she would have gotten fired because she was bossy and smarter than everybody else, I mean, it was a false prosperity in some ways. I mean, it was real and we experienced it as real, but you have to, when you take it apart, you really realize it was a moment in time. The other thing that I think people forget about the 50s was that those guys coming back who bought those houses in Levittown and all those suburbs, they were one or maybe two generations away from being immigrants. And they still had really deep ties to those immigrant families. And you really cannot underestimate the importance of those family ties in giving people the sense of belonging and cohesion that you need to make a society function. I was second generation born in this country. My mother was first generation. My kids are third generation, and every generation gets farther and farther from that feeling of belonging to some group that supports you and nurtures you and makes you who you are. And I think the 50s were just at the right time. There was still that family support for people who were basically the kids of immigrants. And they just whitewash that. You never hear that in the 50s, those housing developments were full of the kids of immigrants, the one or two generations away. And that made That made such a difference. We expected to be in an environment that supported us because we had grown up that way inside our extended families.
One of the things that makes the 1950s possible is that there's a massive amount of spending from the federal government that is giving opportunities to the GIs specifically. You've got the GI Bill that provides the education for millions of people. You've got low interest VA home loans.
Right.
But of course, the way that this program was implemented, those resources were only available, in essence, to white men. It wasn't shared equally among the population.
I'm sure it wasn't. I would guess that a single woman applying for a home loan through the GI Bill, I mean, I can't even imagine that would be allowed. You couldn't even have credit as a woman, so I don't even know how they would give a loan to you.
It's interesting because, you've got the 50s where the default is for women to stay home, but 5 years earlier, the country asked women to join the labor force in massive numbers. So I'm looking at some statistics here. In 1945, 37% of the domestic workforce was women. And then by 1950, it's down to 30%. So you have all these women who helped participate in the effort to defeat, fascism, and then they're asked to go back into the kitchen. And I'm wondering what the psychological toll of ignoring their sort of contribution was.
I mean, I'll tell you, it had a massive psychological impact on us once we entered into the late 60s. I mean, I have a poster on my wall, which you can't see right now, of Rosie the Riveter. We knew nothing about Rosie the Riveter until the late 60s, when women's history started. Women say, hey, you have a history here that you really ought to know about, And I got a flyer once from a group that wanted to do a museum dedicated to the women who flew planes all over the country for the Army, the women pilots who took the place of the men who couldn't, who were at war. Women did every job, and they did it brilliantly. I mean, they ran the whole war effort, and they were fantastic at it. And Black people joined it. It's just like everything else. There's talent wherever you look, if you just look for it. And then the war ends. The Selective Service Act requires employers to fire people and give the soldiers their jobs back. So if they had a job before the war, they would just fire whoever was in the position. So you had millions of people whose work was respected and who made a decent living being told, get out of here and go back to the kitchen, or go to the kitchen. You weren't in the kitchen before, but now you're going to be in the kitchen. And there was government propaganda that did it, and the newsreels that encouraged it, and then the tax code encouraged it, and everything encouraged it. And these women were like, well, what are we supposed to do? We can't get loans. We can't get a decent job. What are we supposed to do? So we were very angry on their behalf. Like 20 years later, we were pissed. They called us feminazis. But really what we were doing was we were just reclaiming history that they just conveniently wanted to throw into the garbage can. Like, let's forget all those women who helped win the war and were pilots and all those other things. Let's just forget about them. We want you to be the backbone of the prosperity in the 50s by holding down the fort in the home while the men get all the jobs. Get out of the labor force. Stop competing with the men. Stay at home. We don't care how smart you are, how talented you are, how brilliant you are, how much the society loses from keeping you in that role. We don't care, because a stupid man is more valuable than two brilliant women.
The other thing, of course, about the GI Bill, the way that it was implemented, is that it was written in a way to accommodate Jim Crow, because it was administered at the state level. And so there were tons and tons of Black men who were in theory eligible for the benefits of the GI Bill, but through the administration of that bill were diverted away from receiving its benefits. And so I did a little research last night specifically into the area where you grew up and found that in the New York and northern New Jersey suburbs, 67,000 mortgages were insured by the GI Bill, but fewer than 100 were taken out by non-whites.
Oh my God. 100?
Less than 100.
100.
Yes. Out of 67,000 mortgages.
I mean, the GI Bill, I don't know if it was true then, but it's true, now that these were no down payment loans. You did not have to come up with a down payment. And that's the thing that is one of the largest bars to home ownership.
Yeah.
So it wasn't because people couldn't afford it. It was because people just were denied it. In my family's deed, there was a clause that said, you are forbidden from selling this house to a black person. Now, I don't remember what the penalty was, whether you just lost possession of the house and it went back to the person that you bought it from, or whether the contract was just null and void. I don't remember. I made my mother show me the deed when I was in law school. I said, is there a restrictive covenant in this? And there was.
Right. I mean, Levittown is one of the, most iconic examples of the suburban neighborhood that was being built. All of those houses were being backed by federal government loans that if they defaulted, the federal government would cover them. And in the contract that Levitt made with the federal government, there were explicit terms that none of the homes would be sold to black people and none of the homes would be resold to black people in the future.
And that was illegal, by the way. It had been illegal since 1947 to put a restrictive covenant in a deed. But there was one in my parents' deed, and that was sold in 1949. So it was just ignored. I mean, that's the government saying, we don't want you to prosper. That's what it's saying.
If you think about the enduring impact of that today, think about a family that gets a no-interest loan on a home at that time.
No down payment.
No down payment, but low interest probably. But in any case, they're getting a benefit from the federal government to help them own a home, which appreciates and can be passed down generation over generation. Think about how much wealth was federally subsidized specifically to those white GIs and denied to all the other black people who should have been able to benefit from those programs, but were denied it.
I mean, one of my relatives bought a house in a very nice suburb of Westchester for $4,000. No down payment required. That house is worth over $1 million right now, well over $1 million. They owned it free and clear most of their lives because it was so cheap. So their family is financially secure now and, will be for like 2 generations. Anybody could afford, a mortgage payment of $100 a month or $70 a month, which was kind of what it would be. The 50s was an anomaly. It was a blip, but it was also the result, like you say, of a massive investment by the government in the middle class, in establishing a white middle class.
Yes.
I mean, it was deliberate. It was massive. It was almost like the Marshall Plan, which we had for rebuilding Europe. It was really like that for the United States. I'm all about that. I think we could go back to having a new, massive investment in the middle class like we did in the 1950s. I think we need that right now.
The irony of this era is that MAGA, Make America Great Again movement, harkens back to the 1950s because they see the regimented social structure and hierarchies and want that back. But there's actually a lot to learn from the 1950s. Here are some other stats about this era that are pretty jaw-dropping. The top income tax rate was 91% for income over $200,000. The level of income inequality was so much less in the 1950s than it is today. The union membership was the highest that it had ever been in the nation's history. About
Right.
1/3 of workers were in unions. You've also got the highway expansion, which was, the biggest government infrastructure program in history. You've got proof of concept that investment in people works. The only thing was a whole bunch of people, including Black people and women, were left out of that deal. And so the interesting thing that happens next is when those constituencies start saying, hey, we want our piece of the pie, then suddenly support for this type of role of government starts to erode.
This was invisible to people. I mean, just like I grew up in one of the most diverse, gigantic cities in the world, in New York, but it was the multiculturalism in some ways was invisible to me, because I didn't experience it in my life. And when people don't think about that when they think about the 50s, and they certainly don't think about the massive government investment that made the 50s possible, maybe because they didn't really think about it that way. It was just like, well, the GI Bill, but because of course we should pay the GIs. But there it is. I mean, that's the truth of it. And you're right, it is a proof of concept. And so when you think of going back to the 50s, what these 2025 people think about really is they don't just want children that obey their parents. They want women to be indentured servants again. I mean, their view of like the roles in society are women's job is caretakers, and anybody who steps out of that role is a bitch, a feminazi. If you just say, God gave me all these gifts, why can't I use them just like you? That's just blasphemy and heresy. Your job is to be a mother and a caregiver. They just want to go back to this time where there was this enforced indentured servitudes, like you'll be in this role and you'll like it. Women liked it in the 50s. Like, no, they didn't. The rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, and physical abuse in the families were out of this world, and depression and psychological problems and all this kind of stuff were out of this world because a lot of women didn't want that role. Some women did. Good for them. Stay at home. And I got no problem with that. But don't stop me from doing it if I want to follow a different path. So when people talk about going back to the 50s, we're not going back there. What we should go back to is a time when the government said, we want to invest in the middle class. We know that the soldiers coming home, there was not enough housing. So they built housing. There's not enough housing now for the kids who can't, the Gen Zs and people, they can't even afford rent. It's time for a new massive government investment in that generation, just like there was in the post-war generation. That I could get along with. And the other thing was, it was built on union membership, like you said, and it was built on immigrant families. You can't forget the part that those played in creating all that stability that they crave. They enforced the antitrust laws, and CEOs, I think, made 30 times what the average worker made instead of hundreds or thousands of times. That massive investment was paid for in large part by taxes on the ultra rich, so that we didn't have a super ultra rich like we do now. They paid their fair share so that everybody could have a good life. And when they stopped paying their fair share is when everything really fell apart. You want to go back to the 50s? Go back to that part of the 50s.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because both coalitions have nostalgia for the 50s, just different parts of it. I mean, I'm all for going back to a lot of these policies. They were more progressive than we have now. The problem was they only existed for certain people. They didn't include everyone in the bargain. I want to know what your opinion on this is. So, I mean, this is kind of a question about human nature. But what's your take on the fact that suddenly when Black people and women said, hey, we want to be cut in on the deal that you've been giving exclusively or almost exclusively to white men, when you do that, suddenly they're like, well, then no one can have it. It's so self-defeating, of course, because suddenly you're opposing programs that would help you because other people would also benefit from it.
These programs are so invisible to most people. They don't realize how much they benefit from them. And when the programs are announced as expansions of existing policies, like this program exists, but now we're going to include women and we're going to include Black people and all this, that all they hear is women and Black people. They don't hear the other part. They don't experience the other part in their lives, and nobody points it out to them. Republicans are happy not to point it out because they want to get rid of the program anyway, and they want to turn the races against each other because it's very profitable for them to stay in power with their diminishing base of support. People are so brainwashed into thinking that everything they did, they earned without the help of the government. The government never gave them a hands up. You remember in the 2010 when they were opposing Obamacare and these women would have these signs that said, hands off my Medicare.
Keep your government hands off
Government
my
hands
Medicare.
off my Medicare, as if they didn't even realize that Medicare was an entitlement program. They had no idea. And I really fault the Democratic Party. What a bunch of idiots in terms of marketing.
The other side of the coin to Democrats being bad at marketing their policies is that Republicans have been very good at demonizing their policies. They've made it so that welfare is synonymous with poor Black people that are getting undeserved help. They've made it so that any government assistance is looked at as unfair money going to undeserving people, even though, as we just mentioned, those massive government investments in the 1950s are what essentially created the American middle class in the first place. I mean, it's what W.E.B. Du Bois calls the psychological wages of whiteness. It's the idea that there's a hidden wage that comes with the knowledge that you're higher on the pecking order, on the social ladder, that if you have this notion that you're above another person, that there's a psychological wage. It's not actual money, but it takes the form of a wage, and that people are not willing to let go of those psychological wages of superiority. And I think that's what these reactionary politicians are playing on, that desire of people to be higher on the social economic ladder than other people.
To me, it's not even you're higher. It's just not you're just not lower. You're not on the bottom.
Right.
You know, you're not the one who's on the very bottom. You want someone to be below you. You're trying to climb the social ladder, but really while you're climbing it, it would be good that someone else is on the bottom. I mean, it's a human trait, but they're always looking in the wrong direction. They should be looking up the ladder instead of down the ladder.
Heather McGhee wrote this great book called The Sum of Us, where she sort of talks about this formula that had been created for prosperity, but that was denied certain groups of people. And she talks about this story of a public pool that had been funded through, New Deal programs, funded through the tax dollars of everyone, that were only available to the white citizens. And then as soon as, judges desegregated access to those pools, instead of allowing everyone to swim, they just drained the pools so no one could swim.
Right.
And I feel like that's what happened across all of these policies, is that suddenly when women and Black people and other groups that had been denied these benefits said, we want ours, then suddenly no one could have it.
Also because they had theirs now. Then
Yeah.
they had already had theirs, so they didn't care. But now their kids are in the same position, that the vets were returning from the war. If it weren't for government intervention, if it wasn't for, policies that promoted union membership and job training and the GI Bill that paid for your college and the VA loans that you could buy, you would zero down. You wouldn't have the 50s. You wouldn't have had the 50s. You would have had a lot of soldiers who were just really, really poor, going back to their farms and going back to their dead-end jobs and going back to their, minimum wage jobs. But the government said, no, we want to do something very different. We want to invest in, a rising middle class. I'm all about that. The 50s would never have happened without that. Just like if there had been no-fault divorce, the 50s would never have happened if there had been no-fault divorce. Women would have been able to get out of these, horrific marriages. And then what would the culture have done? It would have had to have adjusted.
Yeah, I looked up the divorce rate in the 1950s. In 1958, the rate was the lowest in record. Now, Project 2025 is trying to make it illegal to have a no-fault divorce.
Of course they are, because they also want women to stay home. They also are attacking birth control, force women into marriages and force them to have children once they're in the marriage because they won't be able to use birth control. Because they want workers, and they want workers because that's cheap labor. The more babies you have, that's the more labor. The more labor there is, more competition for fewer jobs, the cheaper the laborer has to agree to, just like we were 100 years ago. That it's no accident that those things all go together. Of course they go together. In the old days when you didn't have no-fault divorce, if you were Catholic, you couldn't get out. You could get an annulment, but that was only for the Kennedys, and rich people with connections to the Archbishop. You had to fly to Las Vegas and live in a motel for 6 weeks and get residency and then get a divorce under the Las Vegas laws and then take it back to your state and hope the state would acknowledge it, which some of them didn't. Or you could hire, one of the divorce mills to stage infidelity, where the husband would go rent a hotel room and get in bed with a woman, and the photographer would rush in and take a picture. Then the wife could say, oh, I'm suing on grounds of infidelity. And of course, everyone knew it was all perjury. The judge knew, the lawyers knew, the photographer knew, everybody. There were companies that just did this. So there's always a way around it, but only for women of means.
Right.
But we're not going back there. It's too late. I just hope that American women wake up enough to realize that some of us remember when those bad old days existed and women were trapped in those loveless marriages and abusive marriages, and that, it could come back. There are people who want you back in those situations, and, you have the power to stop it. And don't think it can't happen, because it can and it will if you don't wake up. So wake up. Vote. And don't vote for Donald Trump either.
No.
Because then you're stupid. Talk about voting against your own interests. I mean, what the hell's wrong with you?
So any other insights about this era and what we can learn from it as we wrap up this episode?
Yeah. I mean, you belonged somewhere. People took care of each other. There were no box stores, gigantic box stores. There were just neighborhood stores. You patronized those stores, even if they cost more, because your neighbor owned that business and you wanted to support them. You knew them. They knew you. The dress store knew your size and your family and everything else. People felt the obligation to take care of each other. It wasn't all people for themselves. People really did take care of each other. And, the feeling of respect and of community and of neighborhood and all of that is really worth preserving and having back. And I'd be all about that. Keep it simple. Get off your phone. Get outside and play in the park.
And invest in people's future. Just this time, cut everyone in on the deal.
We really need that massive investment in our kids, in our middle class now, just like we had then.
I think that Kamala and Tim Walz are projecting that type of plan. $6,000 tax credit for kids the first year of their life, going back to the child tax credit that we had under Biden that cut child poverty in half, and up to $25,000 help with a down payment on a first-time home buyer.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that's a great start. That's the right track. Really help people get ahead and build more housing, just like they did in the 50s, because clearly we need it. And don't let investors come in and buy it all up. Leave it for actual people.
All right, Mom. Thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, child.
All right, bye. Mwah. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for watching. As we close, I thought I'd just show a little bit more footage of my mom from the 1950s, because I just love it so much. Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you're enjoying these videos, please consider liking and subscribing. We're so close to that 1,000 subscriber number, and it would be amazing if this video helped us get there. My mom and I have lots more things to say. We appreciate you all, and we'll see you next time.